They call it pigweed, a term designed to strip value from what three empires classified as sacred grain. While modern agriculture collapses under drought, this plant produces more protein per acre than cattle, requires no irrigation, and thrives in conditions that kill wheat. It was banned not because it failed, but because it succeeded without dependence. What you're about to discover isn't agricultural history. It's a blueprint for systematic erasure. In 1519, Spanish forces documented Aztec tributes measured in tons, not gold. Grain. Amaranth, known as huautli, formed the foundation of an empire that fed millions across terrain, where European crops would later fail catastrophically. Cortés didn't just conquer territory, he targeted the food supply with surgical precision. Colonial records show deliberate eradication campaigns, fields burned, storage facilities destroyed, cultivation punishable by death. The justification entered official documentation, not as military strategy, but religious correction. Amaranth seeds were mixed with human blood in Aztec rituals, compressed into figures of deities, then consumed. The Spanish crown classified this as idolatry. The solution wasn't conversion of practice, it was elimination of the plant itself. Within a generation, a crop that had sustained 15 million people was reclassified from administrative currency to forbidden substance. But the threat wasn't spiritual, it was structural. Amaranth doesn't require the systems that wheat demands. Aztec agricultural records preserved in codices reveal cultivation methods that contradicted every principle of European farming. No ploughing, no irrigation canals, seeds scattered across hillsides considered too steep for traditional agriculture. Harvests recorded at 1,000 to 3,000 pounds per acre without fertilization. The Florentine Codex documents storage techniques that kept grain edible for decades, sealed in clay vessels, buried in dry caves, creating strategic food reserves that insulated the empire from regional crop failures. When drought destroyed maize in one province, amaranth reserves maintained population stability. The Spanish recognized what this represented, a civilization that couldn't be starved into submission. Colonial administrators didn't just ban cultivation, they banned knowledge transfer. Indigenous farmers caught teaching amaranth propagation faced land confiscation. Within 80 years, written records of cultivation techniques were reduced to fragments. The plant itself survived, but its status had been rewritten. From currency to contraband, the technology embedded in amaranth wasn't genetic accident. It was biological architecture designed for civilizational insurance. Each plant produces up to 500,000 seeds. A single handful, roughly 1,000 seeds, weighs 3 grams. 1 kilogram contains approximately 330,000 seeds, enough to plant 100 acres at traditional Aztec seeding density. Storage requirements approached zero. Unlike wheat, which demands controlled humidity and temperature, amaranth seeds remain viable in fluctuating conditions for up to 40 years. Inca populations in high-altitude regions, where maize cultivation failed above 11,000 feet, relied on kiwicha, their term for amaranth species, adapted to freezing nights and intense solar radiation. Archaeological evidence from Andean sites shows storage pits containing amaranth alongside quinoa, creating layered food security. The combination wasn't cultural preference, it was systematic redundancy. If one crop failed, the other compensated. Spanish agricultural reports from newly conquered territories noted this resilience with frustration. Attempts to replace amaranth with wheat required irrigation systems, annual replanting, and yields that collapsed without constant labor input. Amaranth required none of this. It self-seeded. It tolerated poor soil. It survived neglect. And that made it dangerous to a colonial economy built on dependence. The Dust Bowl exposed what systematic crop replacement had created. Between 1930 and 1936, wheat production across the American Great Plains collapsed by 70%. Topsoil, depleted by decades of monoculture, turned to airborne dust storms visible from 200 miles away. Federal agricultural surveys documented complete harvest failures across Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas. Fields planted with wheat returned nothing. But reports from the same regions noted wild amaranth continuing to grow, producing seed heads while domestic crops died. Farmers called it pigweed, cursed it as invasive, and burned it to clear fields for wheat they couldn't grow. The plant that survived the conditions wheat created was classified as the problem. During the same period, researchers at botanical stations in Mexico rediscovered amaranth cultivation among isolated indigenous communities. These populations, disconnected from commercial agriculture, had maintained cultivation knowledge suppressed for 400 years. Interviews documented yields matching Aztec records, 2,000 pounds per acre without irrigation, in soil classified as unsuitable for modern crops. The data reached U.S. agricultural agencies. It was filed, not implemented. The infrastructure was already built for wheat. Changing systems would require admitting the system was designed wrong. Modern nutritional analysis reveals why amaranth was classified as sacred grain, not animal feed. Protein content ranges from 13% to 19%, compared to wheat's 10% to 13%. But the difference isn't quantity, it's amino acid profile. Amaranth contains lysine at concentrations double those found in wheat, completing the protein requirements humans need without animal sources. A population surviving on amaranth alone avoids the protein deficiencies that plague wheat-dependent diets. Calcium content exceeds milk per equivalent weight. Iron concentrations surpass spinach. This isn't superfood marketing, it's biological fact, confirmed by USDA nutritional databases and replicable through spectroscopy. The Aztecs didn't worship amaranth because of mythology. They structured an empire around it because the mathematics worked. 1 acre of amaranth could sustain more people with less labor than any grain the Spanish introduced. Colonial administrators understood this. That's why suppression wasn't military. It was agricultural policy enforced as religious mandate. Water requirements expose the economic threat amaranth represents to modern systems. Wheat cultivation demands approximately 130 gallons of water per pound of grain produced. Rice requires 290 gallons. Beef, fed on grain, reaches 1,800 gallons per pound. Amaranth grows with seasonal rainfall, producing equivalent nutrition at 30 gallons per pound in documented field trials across arid regions. Land efficiency follows the same pattern. 1 acre of amaranth, processed for grain and leaves, yields 6,000 pounds of edible material. The same acre planted with cattle feed, converted to beef, returns 75 pounds of meat. This isn't comparison, it's existential contrast. Agricultural subsidies in the United States allocate $20 billion annually to corn, wheat, and soy. Amaranth receives zero federal crop support. It's classified by the USDA under specialty crops, a category that excludes it from commodity programs. But the classification isn't administrative accident. It's structural protection. A crop that requires no inputs, no irrigation infrastructure, and no annual seed purchase threatens every revenue model industrial agriculture depends on. So it's reclassified, not as food but as weed, not as drought insurance but as invasive species. 38 U.S. states list amaranth species under noxious weed regulations, requiring landowners to eradicate it on site. The plant that survives when systems collapse is legally banned before collapse arrives. Scientific validation of ancestral knowledge has become undeniable, yet remains agriculturally irrelevant. Research published in the Journal of Agricultural and Food Chemistry confirms amaranth protein quality exceeds FAO standards for human nutrition. Studies from drought-prone regions in Africa show amaranth outperforming maize in water-scarce conditions by 300% yield differential. Trials in India demonstrate cultivation success on marginal land classified as unsuitable for conventional crops. The data exists, implementation doesn't. Why? Because modern agriculture isn't optimized for nutrition per acre. It's optimized for commodity volume compatible with existing processing infrastructure. Amaranth seeds are smaller than wheat. They don't fit standard milling equipment. Harvesting requires different machinery. Storage, transportation, and processing would demand infrastructure investment that threatens established supply chains. The crop that fed empires for millennia can't penetrate modern markets not because it fails nutritionally, but because it succeeds outside approved systems. And systems don't adapt to superior alternatives. They reclassify threats until collapse forces change. The mechanism of erasure follows identical patterns across food systems. Amaranth, banned for resilience. Hemp, prohibited despite fiber and protein density. Carob replaced by chocolate dependent on equatorial monoculture. Each provided regional food security, independent of global supply chains. Each required minimal water, thrived without chemical inputs, and stored for years. Each was systematically marginalized through language first, regulation second. Hemp became associated with drug production, obscuring its use as food and textile for 10,000 years. Carob was rebranded as imitation chocolate, stripping cultural significance as Mediterranean survival food through famine cycles. Amaranth became pigweed, a term that removes value linguistically before legal prohibition completes economic erasure. The pattern isn't coincidence. It's replication of the colonial model Cortés deployed in 1519. Identify the food source that creates independence, reclassify it as primitive, dangerous, or inferior, replace it with crops requiring purchased inputs, enforce dependence through subsidy structures that make alternatives economically unviable. The result isn't efficient agriculture, it's controlled agriculture, vulnerable to precisely the conditions amaranth was designed to survive. Climate projections confirm what indigenous agriculture already solved. The IPCC forecasts 30% decline in wheat yields across current growing regions by 2050 due to temperature increase and water scarcity. Maize production faces similar collapse in zones shifting from temperate to semi-arid classification. Rice cultivation, dependent on flood irrigation, becomes unsustainable as aquifer depletion accelerates. The crops that feed 60% of human calories are approaching systemic failure, under conditions amaranth considers optimal. Heat tolerance testing shows amaranth maintaining photosynthetic efficiency at temperatures 10 degrees Celsius above wheat's threshold. Drought trials demonstrate continued seed production after 40 consecutive days without rainfall, conditions that kill conventional grains outright. This isn't future speculation, it's present reality in regions already experiencing agricultural collapse. Yet policy discussions focus on genetic modification of existing crops, attempting to engineer heat and drought tolerance into species fundamentally incompatible with projected conditions. The solution already exists, documented in codices 500 years old. But accepting it requires admitting the system was built wrong, that food security was sacrificed for economic control, that the crop classified as weed is the grain that survives what's coming. Every suppressed food system contains the same choice: delayed until delay becomes crisis. Return voluntarily to what works, or wait for collapse to force reversion. Amaranth cultivation is expanding in Mexico, not through policy, but through farmer recognition that wheat no longer survives seasonal drought. Seed banks in India are distributing amaranth varieties to regions where maize subsidies can't compensate for consecutive harvest failures. This isn't agricultural trend, it's early survival behavior before systemic collapse makes it mandatory. The knowledge wasn't lost. It was criminalized, then ignored, then forgotten by populations taught that dependence equals modernity. What the Aztecs engineered as insurance, colonial systems classified as idolatry. What survived the Dust Bowl was burned as invasive. What thrives as wheat dies is banned as noxious. The plant didn't change, the classification system did, and when that system collapses under conditions it created, the grain it tried to erase will be the grain that remains. Not because amaranth is sacred, because it works when nothing else does. If this vault revealed what they reclassified from empire to weed, subscribe to uncover what survival knowledge was buried by design. The evidence only matters if someone remembers it existed. The next vault opens soon.